Nobody told Ivory Wells that the night she walked into Park Hyun-jae's office would be the last night of her old life. She knew the building. She had driven past it 100 times, a glass tower on the edge of Koreatown that caught the sunset and held it like a secret. 32 floors of legitimate business wrapped around something that the city's best attorneys had spent 15 years trying to prove existed and never could. From the outside, it looked like money. From the inside, she would learn, it looked like power so dense it had its own gravity. She was 29 years old. She had $63 in her checking account, a brother in a hospital bed, and a mother who had co-signed a loan 3 years ago from a man she didn't fully understand was not a banker. The debt was $480,000. Ivory had nothing. She had never had nothing before. She had always had just enough, the specific amount that keeps a person moving without ever letting them rest. But this was different. This was a number so large, it stopped being a number and became a sentence. She rode the elevator to the 28th floor with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged into something she hoped looked like composure. The woman in the elevator's mirrored walls looked back at her, tall, dark-skinned, locks pulled back neatly, a blazer she had pressed twice that morning because she had needed something to do with her hands. She looked like a woman who had her life together. That was the first useful lie she had told all day. The elevator opened into a reception area that smelled like cedar and cold air. A woman at the desk looked up without warmth. Behind her, through a set of glass doors, a man sat at a desk the size of a small country. Park Hyun-jae did not look up when Ivory was shown in. He was reading something. He read it the way powerful men read things, not as if the information mattered, but as if the act of reading it was itself a demonstration of something. His face was angular and unreadable, black hair pushed back from his forehead, a jaw that looked like it had been designed to hold difficult decisions without flinching. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and no tie, and he looked like a man who had decided formality was something other people needed. He let her stand there for 45 seconds. She counted. Then he looked up. His eyes were dark and completely still. Not cold, that wasn't quite right. Cold implies an absence of temperature. His eyes held something else, the specific stillness of a man who had learned that the world rearranged itself around patience. "Ivory Wells?" he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," she said. "Sit down." She sat. "Your mother borrowed $480,000 from my organization 3 years ago. She used it to cover your brother's first surgery, the down payment on your family home, and an outstanding IRS debt. She has made 11 payments totaling $62,000. She has not made a payment in 7 months. Your brother's condition has worsened, and you are now his primary caregiver. Your mother cannot work. You earn $31,000 a year as a paralegal at Hines & Cross." He closed the folder. "You cannot pay this debt." Ivory kept her face exactly still. "I know." "Then why are you here?" "Because I'd rather negotiate than disappear." Something moved behind his eyes. Almost nothing, but she caught it. The faintest register of a man recalibrating. "Negotiate," he repeated. "I have skills. I have time. I have the willingness to work. I don't have money, but I have everything else, and I'm asking you to let me use those things instead." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to forgive the debt. I'm asking you to let me earn it off." Park Hyun-jae looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that takes inventory. "That," he said, "is either the bravest thing anyone has said in this office or the most naive." "It can be both," Ivory said. And that was the moment, though neither of them knew it yet, that everything began. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. You're about to spend the next 40 minutes wondering how a debt became a destiny. This is Ivory's story, and his. Welcome to Love in the Underworld. Ivory Wells had grown up understanding debt the way some children grow up understanding weather, as something atmospheric, always present, capable of turning without warning. Her mother, Dolores, was a woman of enormous love and genuinely terrible financial judgment. Not from carelessness, from desperation, which is a different thing entirely, though the outcomes often look the same from the outside. Dolores had raised two children alone after Ivory's father left when Ivory was 11 and her brother Marcus was 6. She had worked 3 jobs for 4 years. She had held the family together with the specific ferocity of a woman who had decided that her children would not feel the full weight of what was happening, even if it killed her. It nearly had. Marcus's diagnosis came when he was 19, a heart condition that the doctors explained with diagrams and statistics and the particular careful language of people delivering news they know will detonate. 3 surgeries minimum, possibly more. The kind of medical trajectory that makes insurance companies suddenly remember their fine print. Dolores had done what desperate people do. She had borrowed from the wrong place. The man who arranged the loan had presented himself as a private lender, a community businessman, someone who helped families when banks turned them away. He had given Dolores a handshake and a folder of paperwork, and a smile that she later described to Ivory as warm, which was how she knew, in retrospect, that it had been manufactured. The interest had been buried in language Dolores didn't understand. By the time Ivory sat down with the documents, 3 years later, the night her mother called her crying, the original loan had grown like something alive. Ivory had spent that whole night at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, going through every page. She was a paralegal. She knew how to read documents. She read these ones with the focused dread of a person diffusing something they weren't trained to diffuse. By morning, she had a number. $480,000. And a name. Park Hyun-jae. She knew the name the way everyone in certain circles of the city knew it, peripherally, carefully, the way you know the name of a weather system that has been building offshore for years. She had processed documents at Hines and Cross that danced carefully around his organization. She had seen the way the senior partners spoke about him, with the precise neutrality of people who understood that some things were better observed than touched. She also knew that he had a reputation that divided people sharply. The people who feared him said he was without mercy, that the organization he ran operated on one principle: debts were paid one way or another. The people who had actually dealt with him said something more complicated, that he was ruthless, but not cruel, that he kept his word in a world where most people's word was decorative, that the families of people who worked for him were taken care of in ways that no legitimate employer ever matched. Ivory didn't know which version was true. She suspected, as with most things, the answer was both. She requested the meeting through a number she found in her mother's paperwork. She expected to be ignored. Instead, she received a response within 6 hours. A time, an address, a single line. Come alone. She told her mother she had a work appointment. She told Marcus she'd be back before dinner. She pressed her blazer twice. She rode the elevator to the 28th floor, and she did not let her hands shake. What Ivory did not know, could not know, was that she was already 3 weeks pregnant. She didn't know yet because she hadn't let herself think about what had happened 6 weeks ago. The one night that now sat at the back of her mind like a door she kept walking past without opening. She would open it eventually. She would have to. But not yet. First, the debt. The debt was the thing she could do something about. Everything else would have to wait.
She started on a Monday. The 28th floor had a rhythm to it that Ivory spent her first week mapping with the careful attention she brought to every new environment. The organization's legitimate front, Park Holdings, an investment and property management firm, operated with the precision of a machine that had been running long enough to know its own tolerances. Everything was documented, everything was filed. The paper trail was meticulous and completely clean because the real business existed in a layer beneath the paper trail, and the paper trail's job was to be uninteresting. Ivory understood this without being told. She was a paralegal. She knew how documents could be made to tell a story that was technically true and functionally misleading. She had spent 4 years watching senior partners do it in a different context. She recognized the architecture immediately. She said nothing about this. She filed what she was given to file. She drafted what she was given to draft. She answered correspondence in 3 languages with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years, because she had. By Wednesday, Hyun-jae's personal assistant, a meticulous Korean man named Sejun, who wore the expression of someone perpetually 3 minutes behind schedule, had quietly rerouted several of his more complex tasks to her desk without being asked to. By Friday, Sejun had knocked on her office door and said, in a tone somewhere between reluctant and relieved, "You're better at this than I expected." "What did you expect?" Ivory asked. Sejun considered this with uncomfortable honesty. Someone who would need more supervision. "I don't need supervision," Ivory said pleasantly. "I need accurate information and clear deadlines." Sejun nodded. "I'll remember that." What nobody on the 28th floor knew was that by Friday, Ivory had also been sick every morning between 6 and 7:30, had eaten saltine crackers at her desk and called it breakfast, and had spent her lunch break in the single-stall bathroom on the 27th floor, where no one from her floor would hear her, and had a conversation with herself in the mirror that she was not ready to have with anyone else. You know what this is. She knew what it was. She was 8 weeks pregnant. She confirmed it Thursday night with a test she bought at a pharmacy 12 blocks from her apartment, standing in her bathroom with the water running so her mother wouldn't hear anything through the wall. The father was a man named Devin Harris. They had dated for 4 months. He had been kind and funny and genuinely good company until the night she told him Marcus's condition had worsened and she would need to be less available for a while. At which point he had revealed, with the speed of someone who had been waiting for an exit, that he didn't think they were really compatible long-term anyway. That had been 2 months ago. He did not know about the pregnancy. She had not decided yet what to tell him, or when, or whether the answer to both questions might be nothing and never. She sat in her office on Friday afternoon and looked at the spreadsheet she had been asked to reconcile and thought, I am 29 years old. I am pregnant and alone. I am working off a debt to a man who runs a criminal organization, and my brother is in a hospital bed, and my mother cannot know any of this. Then she reconciled the spreadsheet. Because the spreadsheet needed to be reconciled, and falling apart was a luxury she would schedule for later. It was at 6:15 on that Friday, when the floor had mostly emptied and Ivory was finishing the last of the reconciliation, that Hyun-jae appeared in the doorway of her office. She hadn't heard him coming. He moved quietly for a man his size, not sneaking, just economical. The specific silence of someone who had learned that observation requires stillness. "You're still here," he said. The reconciliation had a discrepancy in the third quarter column. I found it. It was a data entry error from 2 months ago that had been compounding. I fixed it and traced it back to the source. A pause. Sejun missed that for 2 months, he said. Sejun is managing 14 things at once. I was only managing 1. She hit save and finally looked up. It's fixed now. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her with the same still attention he had turned on her in his office 5 days ago. In the ambient light of the nearly empty floor, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, he looked less like a business edifice and more like an actual person, which she found faintly inconvenient. "Go home," he said. "The building will still be here Monday." "I know. I was about to leave." She began shutting down her workstation. "Is there something you needed?" "I wanted to know if you had any questions. First week." Ivory paused. It was an expectedly human thing for him to say. She filed it away. One question. The Meridian Holdings file, the one that came across my desk this afternoon, the contract language in Section 4 has a clause that I've seen before in cases involving shell company transfers. I wasn't sure if that was intentional or if someone had used a template without reviewing it. The quality of his stillness changed, slightly, almost imperceptibly. It was intentional, he said. Okay, then I'll leave it as is. I just wanted to make sure someone knew it was there. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. He stepped aside to let her pass. Ivory, he said when she was in the hallway. She turned. The clause you identified, 3 of my attorneys missed it. She held his gaze. Then you need better attorneys. She walked to the elevator. She did not look back, but she heard just before the elevator doors opened something that might have been a quiet exhale of something that might have been a laugh. Before we go further, drop a comment right now and tell me, does Ivory tell him about the pregnancy, or does she protect that secret for as long as she can? Because the answer is going to change everything. Subscribe to Love in the Underworld so you don't miss what happens next. Weeks pass the way weeks do when a person is surviving rather than living. Quickly, in a blur of tasks and small victories and exhaustion that settles into the body like sediment. Ivory learned the architecture of Hyunjae's world the way she learned every new environment, methodically, without drawing attention to the learning. She learned which of his lieutenants were competent and which performed competence. She learned that the real decisions happened in the 20 minutes before his official meetings, in the hallway conversations and the one-line texts, and that the meetings themselves were theater for whoever needed to believe they had been consulted. She learned that he drank his coffee black and arrived before 7 every morning, and that the only person he spoke to with anything resembling warmth was a man named Jin Ho, who was 63 and had known Hyunjae since he was 17, and addressed him with the specific informal ease of someone who had watched him become what he was, and therefore wasn't impressed by it. She learned, slowly and against her intentions, that the version of him that existed in rumor and in the careful language of Hines and Cross partners was not a fiction, but it was incomplete. He was exacting. He was without patience for incompetence or dishonesty. When a junior associate made an error that cost the organization a contract, the correction was swift and absolute and held no room for the associate's explanation of why it had happened. Results mattered. Process mattered only insofar as it produced results. But she also watched him, one Tuesday afternoon, spend 45 minutes on the phone with the widow of a man who had worked for his organization for 12 years, not delegating the call, not shortening it, but sitting at his desk and listening with the unhurried attention he brought to everything, asking after the woman's children by name, arranging something that Ivory wasn't close enough to hear, but that she saw result in Jin Ho quietly making a call of his own immediately afterward. She watched him refuse, twice, to authorize something she overheard being proposed in a meeting she was not technically part of, something involving a family who had borrowed and couldn't pay. She didn't hear the full conversation. She heard enough. The refusal was flat and final and required no explanation. She filed these observations the way she filed everything, carefully, without yet knowing what they added up to. The pregnancy was at 11 weeks now, and she was still not showing in any way that couldn't be explained by the cut of her clothes. She had seen an OB/GYN in a neighborhood where no one knew her. The baby was healthy. She was healthy. She had sat in the paper-covered chair in the small examination room and looked at the ultrasound image and felt something that she was not yet ready to name, something too large and too frightening and too tender to examine directly. She thought about Devon. She had called him once. He hadn't answered. She had not called again. She thought about what it would mean to do this alone and found that the answer was the same as everything else. You figured out what needed to be done. You did it. You didn't fall apart until you could afford to, and then only briefly. It was a Thursday evening,
12 weeks into her arrangement, when the first real test came. She was working late, a pattern Hyun-jae had stopped commenting on because she was always finished and always accurate, and the work always reflected someone who had given it complete attention. The floor was empty except for her, the overnight security on the lower levels, and Hyun-jae himself, who was in his office with the door not quite closed. She heard voices. Not raised, the opposite of raised, the specific low register that men use when a conversation is serious and they don't want it carried. She heard her name. Not her full name, just the Wells woman, and then a voice she didn't recognize. She's going to become a liability. Someone who sees this much from the outside, it's a risk. And then a pause. And then Hyun-jae's voice, quiet and final, she's not a liability. She's under my agreement. That's sufficient. A longer pause. And the after 6 months? A silence that lasted long enough that Ivory had stopped pretending to type and was sitting completely still, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged. That's not your concern, Hyun-jae said. The other voice said nothing more. She heard the sound of someone leaving, then silence. She sat for a moment. Then she resumed typing. 10 minutes later, Hyun-jae appeared in her doorway. I heard that, Ivory said, before he could speak. He looked at her. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. You should know I heard it. Whatever you decide to do with that information is your decision, but I won't sit here and act like I was too focused on my spreadsheet to understand what was being discussed 8 feet away. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to say? Nothing, if you don't have anything true to say. She met his eyes. I took this arrangement knowing there were risks. I've kept my conditions. I'll keep them until the end of 6 months. What happens after that, I'd like to believe you're a man who honors his agreements. I am. Then I'm not worried, Ivory said. She returned to her screen. Hyun-jae stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he said quietly, Go home, Ivory. It's late. Almost done, she said. She heard him return to his office. She heard him stay there. She finished her work. She put on her coat. She stopped at his door. It was still not quite closed, and said, without going in, Good night. Good night. She walked to the elevator. Inside, alone in the mirrored box dropping through the building, she let out a breath that she had been holding for approximately 3 hours. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. The small, secret, impossible thing that was growing there pressed back with its own private gravity. I know, she whispered. I know.
By the 14th week, Ivory had developed the particular skill of a woman carrying a secret in close proximity to someone unusually observant. She adjusted everything by degrees so small that no single change was visible. She kept her blazers buttoned, she positioned her chair so the desk edge was a natural barrier, she ate her crackers before 7 and was composed by 8. She managed her nausea with the specific discipline of a person who had decided that the body was something to be negotiated with rather than surrendered to. She was good at this. She had spent her whole adult life managing things quietly that other people would have found unmanageable. What she had not accounted for was Jinho. Jinho was 63 and had the eyes of a man who had seen everything at least twice and found most of it unsurprising. He had also raised 4 children and had 8 grandchildren, and had, as he mentioned exactly once and with no embellishment, delivered the 3rd grandchild himself in the back of a car because the hospital had been too far. He knew. She understood this on a Wednesday in her 14th week, when Jinho appeared at her desk at 10 in the morning and set down a small container of what turned out to be ginger tea and plain rice crackers, and said only, "For the mornings," and walked away. Ivory sat very still. Then she picked up the tea and drank it, and felt, briefly and entirely against her will, like crying. She didn't. She drank the tea and ate 3 crackers and went back to work. But she filed the gesture in the place where she kept the things she couldn't afford to examine directly, the growing catalog of evidence that this world she had agreed to pass through was more complicated and more human than she had expected. She and Jinho never discussed it directly, but the tea appeared every morning after that, And once, when she had a meeting that ran long and she came back to her desk looking pale and carefully composed, he appeared with a plate of plain toast and set it beside her keyboard without a word, and she said, "Thank you," and he said, "The meeting ran long." And that was the end of it. She was thinking about Jin-ho's tea one afternoon when Hyun-jae sat down across from her desk, not in her visitor chair, but on the edge of her desk itself, which was the most informal she had ever seen him, which was to say, not very informal at all, but marginally less architectural than usual. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." The Daehwa contract. This was a negotiation she had been supporting for 3 weeks, a property acquisition with complications she had helped untangle by identifying a clause that the other party's attorneys had tried to obscure. I read the original survey from 1987. It was referenced in a footnote on page 41 of the title documents. Most people stop reading at the summary. The footnote referenced an easement that had technically expired but that the county hadn't updated in their records. If the transaction had closed without addressing it, the easement could have been resurrected by the adjacent property owner within 3 years. Hyun-jae looked at her. That would have cost the organization approximately $2 million. Yes. My attorneys didn't find it. Your attorneys were reading the summary. I read the footnotes. He was quiet for a moment. The building hummed around them. Somewhere below, the city was doing its endless business. "Why do you read the footnotes?" he asked. It was not the question she had expected. She considered it honestly. "Because I grew up understanding that the important things are usually not where people tell you to look. The main text is what someone wanted you to see. The footnotes are what they hoped you'd miss." Hyun-jae was looking at her with an expression she had catalogued before without being able to fully name, the specific look of a man who was hearing something he recognized from somewhere deep and old in himself, and was deciding whether to acknowledge the recognition. "My father said something similar, not in those words, but the same meaning." This was the most personal thing he had said to her in 14 weeks. She treated it carefully. Was he in this business? He built this business, from nothing, from a neighborhood in Incheon that had been promised things and given nothing. A pause. He believed that the only way to protect people who had nothing was to build something that the people who had everything were afraid of. "Do you believe that?" Ivory asked. He looked at her directly. "I believe it works." "That's not the same thing." The corner of his mouth moved. "No, it's not." He stood up from the edge of her desk. He picked up a document she had left in his reading stack. He paused. "Ivory." She looked up. "The arrangement ends in 6 weeks. I want you to know, when I said the debt would be settled, I meant it, completely. No conditions." She held his gaze. "I know. You're a man who honors his agreements." "I am. I also—" He stopped. The pause was longer than his usual pauses. He seemed to be navigating something, carefully, in the dark. "You've done more than satisfy the terms. I want to make sure you understand that." Ivory looked at him for a long moment. There was something happening in this conversation that she had been noticing for weeks and had been refusing to fully acknowledge. The way his stillness changed when she was in the room, slightly, like a compass needle settling. The way conversations between them had stopped being about work somewhere around week 8 and become something else, something that neither of them had named. The way Jin-ho watched them both with the expression of a man who had already read the last page of a book and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. She thought about the thing growing quietly inside her, the thing she had not told him, the thing she had not told anyone except silently her own reflection and the ginger tea. "Hyun-jae," she said, his first name she had never used before. He was still. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He sat back down on the edge of her desk. He folded his hands. He gave him his complete, still attention. And Ivory Wells, who had spent her whole life swallowing things whole rather than explaining them out loud, opened the door she had been walking past for 14 weeks. She told him everything. Not in pieces, not softened, not with the careful scaffolding of someone managing a reaction.
She told him about Devon, about the 4 months and the exit and the phone call she made once that he didn't answer. She told him about the Thursday night pharmacy, the water running in the bathroom, the test. She told him about the clinic and the ultrasound and the image she had taken home and put in the back of her desk drawer at home because she couldn't look at it directly yet, but couldn't throw it away. She told him she was 14 weeks pregnant with another man's child. She told him she had not told him because it was not his problem, and because she had agreed to an arrangement that had nothing to do with her personal life, and because she was not someone who needed to be taken care of, and because, and this was the part that cost her the most to say, she had been afraid. Not of him. She had been afraid that telling him would change the specific, complicated thing that had been building in this office for 14 weeks, and that the change would only go one direction, away. And she had been protecting it the way she protected everything she couldn't afford to lose. She stopped talking. The building hummed, a car horn somewhere 30 stories below, distant and irrelevant. Hyunjae had not moved during the entire time she was speaking. He had held his own stillness with the particular quality she now recognized as something that was not coldness and not distance, but attention. The full, weighted, complete attention of a man who was actually hearing every word. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "The man," he said finally. "Devon Harris. He knows." "No." "Do you want him to know?" Ivory considered this honestly. "I don't know yet." Hyunjae nodded once. "That's an honest answer. I don't have other kinds." He stood up. He walked to the window, the one that looked out over the city, catching the late afternoon light, and stood there with his hands in his pockets and his back to her. She watched him and waited. "Why were you afraid?" he said without turning. "You said you were afraid of what would change. What did you think would change?" It was, she realized, the most direct question he had ever asked her, and the most dangerous. She answered it the same way she answered everything. Honestly. "I thought you would look at me differently, the way people look at a problem that's become more complicated than they agreed to." She paused. "I've spent a long time being the thing in the room that's more complicated than expected. I'm tired of it. I was protecting something here from becoming that." He turned around. His face was the same as it always was, composed, angular, the expression of a man who had learned to hold difficult things without letting them show. But beneath it, just visible, was something she had not seen in his face before, something that had no armor on it. "You are not a problem," he said. His voice was quiet and absolute. "You have never been a problem. You walked into my office with $63 and a debt that wasn't yours, and you negotiated for your family with the steadiness of someone 10 times more powerful than you had any reason to feel. And you have spent 14 weeks doing the work of 3 people without complaint and with more precision than anyone I have ever employed." He held her gaze. "You are not a problem." Ivory looked at him. "The child," he said finally. "Is the child healthy?" "Yes." "Are you healthy?" "Yes." "Good." He came back to the desk. He sat down across from her, not on the edge this time, but in the chair, the proper chair, facing her directly. "The arrangement ends in 6 weeks. The debt is settled regardless of what happens in this conversation. That doesn't change." He paused. "What changes is what I'm about to say, which I want you to understand is separate from the arrangement and from the debt and from any obligation." Ivory waited. "I don't want you to leave in 6 weeks. I want you to stay, not under any arrangement or any debt or any condition. I want you to stay because..." He stopped. The pause was long and careful and human. "Because this building is a different place when you're in it, and I have spent enough of my life in spaces that were exactly what I expected." The city hummed 30 floors below. The afternoon light moved across the window. Ivory said nothing for a long moment. She was thinking about a lot of things simultaneously. The baby, the debt, her mother, Marcus, the locked door she had spent 14 weeks walking past.
She was thinking about what it meant to be known by someone and not found to be too much. "I need to think," she said. "I know. I need to not make this decision from inside this building. I know that too." She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped. "Hyunjae." "Yes?" "The answer isn't no. I need you to know that. The answer isn't no. I just need time to figure out what the answer actually is." He nodded. "Take what you need." She left. Jin-ho was in the hallway. He looked at her face and then looked away with the discreet tact of a man who had been expecting this conversation approximately 6 weeks. "Good night, Jin-ho," Ivory said. "Good night," Jin-ho said. "Get some rest." She did not get some rest. She went home and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the ultrasound image she had taken from her desk drawer 3 days ago and propped against the fruit bowl without quite knowing why. She sat with it for a long time. Then she called her mother into the kitchen and told her the truth. All of it. Dolores Wells cried. Then she reached across the table and took her daughter's hand in both of hers and held it with the grip of a woman who had held many things that were trying to fall. "You don't carry things alone. You never have to carry things alone." "I know, Mama. I know." 3 days after the conversation in her office, Ivory came back. Not for the arrangement, not for the debt, which Hyunjae had already instructed his accounts department to formally close, zeroed to the penny, with documentation that Ivory kept in a folder she checked 3 times before she believed it. She came back because she had sat at her kitchen table and looked at the ultrasound and thought about what she actually wanted, which was a question she realized she had not asked herself seriously in years. She had asked what was needed, what was owed, what could be managed, what could be endured. What she wanted was different territory, unfamiliar, slightly terrifying. She came back because the answer, when she finally sat still enough to hear it, was complicated and specific and honest. She wanted the work. She was genuinely good at it, and it mattered, and it challenged her in ways the paralegal desk at Hines and Cross had stopped doing 2 years ago. She wanted the conversations, the ones that happened at the edges of the official day, in doorways and over desks, that had become the best part of the last 14 weeks in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged until she was sitting in her kitchen without them. She wanted, and this was the part that terrified her, the man himself. Not the edifice, the actual person she had been watching assemble himself in her presence for 14 weeks. The one who honored agreements and listened without calculating and had sat still while she told him the most exposed thing about herself and responded with a steadiness that she recognized as the rarest thing. She also came back because of Devin Harris. Devin Harris, who had not answered her call. Devin Harris, who had found out she was pregnant through a mutual friend. She wasn't sure how. She had told no one, but information travels the way water travels. And had called her on a Sunday morning with the particular energy of a man who had been advised by someone to get ahead of a situation. The call lasted 11 minutes. She knew because she looked at her phone afterward. Devin explained that he was not in a position to be a father right now, that he had a lot going on professionally, that he hoped she would understand, that he was willing to help financially within reason and wanted her to know he wasn't a bad person. Ivory had listened to all of this with the complete composure of a woman who had already arranged her interior landscape before the call began. Then she said, "I understand. I don't need anything from you. I do need you to know that your name will not be on the birth certificate without your active participation in this child's life, and your active participation requires more than financial contribution within reason. I wish you well, Devin." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her lap for exactly 2 minutes. Then she put it face down on the table and said, to the kitchen and to the small, thriving thing inside her, "We're fine." They were fine. What she had not expected was that Devin Harris, 6 days later, would call Hyunji's business line. She found out about this from Jinho, who appeared at her desk on a Thursday morning, looking like a man who had decided that telling her something was less dangerous than not telling her. A man named Devin Harris called yesterday. He identified himself as the father of your child. He asked for a meeting with Mr. Park. He indicated he was considering pursuing full custody on the basis that you were in an unsuitable work environment. Ivory went very still. What happened? She said. Mr. Park took the call himself, Jinho said. I don't know everything that was said. I know the call lasted 4 minutes. I know that afterward, Mr. Park asked me to pull together information on the custody laws in this state as they pertain to fathers who have made no financial contribution and no prior claim. A pause. I also know that Mr. Park's attorney called Mr. Harris's attorney. It turns out Mr. Harris hired an attorney in the 48 hours between his call with you and his call here, and that the attorney called back this morning and indicated that Mr. Harris had reconsidered his position. Ivory sat completely still for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to Hyunjae's office and knocked once and went in. He was at his desk. He looked up. Devin Harris? Yes. You didn't have to do that. I know. You were handling it. I know that too. He held her gaze. He called my building. He used my building as leverage against you. That's not something I allow. Also, something moved on his face. Something that wasn't quite in his vocabulary yet, but was learning to be. Also, I didn't want him to frighten you, or your child. Ivory looked at him for a long time. Is it done? She asked. It's done. He won't pursue it. He'll sign whatever documentation you want, relinquishing parental rights, if that's what you choose. He has been made to understand, Hyunjae paused, choosing words with the precision of someone who had many available and was selecting the right ones, the full implications of acting in bad faith toward someone under my protection. Under my protection. She heard those words and felt them land somewhere in her chest with a weight she hadn't been prepared for. Not possessive, that wasn't what it was. It was the specific weight of being seen by someone powerful enough that their seeing made a difference. She had spent her whole life being invisible in rooms that had not saved a seat for her. She had spent her whole life carrying things alone because alone was the only option. Ivory, Hyunja said. He came around the desk. He stopped a careful distance from her, close enough to be real, far enough to give her room. I told you 3 days ago that I wanted you to stay. I meant it before I knew about Devin Harris, and I mean it now, and I'll mean it in whatever direction this goes. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to trust me because I intervened. I'm asking you to let me try to be worth trusting, separately, over time. She looked at him for a long moment. The city was doing its business below. The building hummed around them. You already are, she said. That's not the question. What's the question? The question, Ivory said, is whether I can do this, not whether you're worth trusting, whether I know how to let someone, whether I remember how. He nodded. That's a fair question. I'm working on the answer. Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. 2 months later, Ivory was showing clearly and had stopped managing the geometry of her clothing around the fact. The floor had adapted. The floor adapted because Hyunjae adapted, not with announcement, not with policy, but in the way he always did things, by simply behaving as though the reality in front of him was the reality he had always intended. He moved meetings when they ran into her OB appointments without being asked how he knew the schedule. He replaced the chair in her office with one that had better lumbar support, which appeared one morning without explanation. When a visiting associate made a comment, not cruel, just the low-grade thoughtlessness of someone who hadn't considered that a pregnant woman in a powerful man's office might be there because she was good at her work rather than for some other reason, Hyunjae had corrected it in 3 sentences, so quiet and so final that the associate had nodded and never revisited the subject. He did these things without performance, without requiring her acknowledgement or gratitude. He did them the way he did everything, because they were the right thing to do and he had decided to do them. Ivory watched this and cataloged it, and felt, slowly and with the specific caution of a person who has been disappointed enough times to build careful walls, the walls begin to do something she hadn't given them permission to do. She let him in. Not all at once, in the way things actually happen between two guarded people, in increments, in conversations that started about work and ended about something else, in the silences that had stopped being empty and started being comfortable. She told him about her father leaving. She didn't tell it as trauma, she told it as data, the factual architecture of how she had become who she was. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without filling the space with his own parallel story until she was finished. Then he told her about his own father, not the founding myth version he had told her in the early weeks, the Inchio neighborhood, the promise, and the nothing. The other version. The version about a man who had built something powerful and become, in the process, unreachable. About a boy who had learned the business with the focused dedication of someone trying to get close to a person who was already gone. About inheriting an empire and spending the first 3 years simply trying to find within it something that was actually his. "Did you?" Ivory asked. "Find something that was yours?" He looked at her. "I'm still looking," he said, "but I think I'm closer than I've been." She understood what he meant. She didn't say so directly. They were both, she had come to understand, people who communicated in the space between direct statements, who said things sideways and trusted the other person to hear them. It was one of the more disconcerting things they had in common. Marcus met him on a Thursday evening in the 7th month, when Ivory had a late appointment and Hyunjae had offered, carefully, with the particular carefulness of a man aware he was asking something, to drive her to the hospital for a checkup. Marcus was in the waiting room when they arrived. He had been discharged 2 weeks ago and moved home, and was doing what brilliant, angry 17-year-olds do when they are recovering and cannot move at full speed. He read everything he could find and argued with everyone available and looked at the world with the fierce assessment of someone who had spent enough time nearly not being in it to take it personally. He looked at Hyunjae with the specific evaluation of a younger brother who had already decided he was the man of the family and was conducting an interview. "You're the one my sister works for?" Marcus said. "I am," Hyunjae said. "You're complicated," she said. "She's being generous," Hyunjae said. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then looked at Ivory, then back at Hyunjae. "You going to take care of her?" "Marcus," Ivory began. "I'm working on earning the right to do so," Hyunjae said. He said it simply, without deflection. "That's the honest answer." Marcus considered this. "Okay, that's a better answer than I expected." Hyunjae nodded. "Your sister has high standards, I've noticed. She got them from our mother, who you should probably also be afraid of." "I'm already planning for it," Hyunjae said. Marcus, against his apparent intention, almost smiled. Ivory, standing between them in the hospital waiting room with her hand pressed to the small of her back and her heart doing something complicated, thought, this is what it looks like when something is actually being built. Not the debt, not the arrangement, something else. Something that had started in an office on the 28th floor and had been growing quietly at its own pace in the space between two careful people. The thing that was growing in her had a name now, Iris, after her mother, 20 weeks along, a girl. She had told Hyunjae the name on a Wednesday evening, not planning to, just because he had asked, simply, without weight, what she was thinking about calling her, and she had told him. And he had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Iris, that's a name that holds something." "It does," Ivory said. He had looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying to name because she had finally understood that it only had one name, and she was still deciding whether she was ready to say it. "Ivory," Hyunjae said. "I know," she said. "You know what I'm going to say?" "I think so." "Then I'll wait. Until you're ready, however long that is." She looked at him. Don't wait too long. I'm tired of waiting myself. There are moments in a person's life that arrive as the answer to a question asked years ago in a different body. Ivory had been 9 years old on that sidewalk. Lavender dress, bay window, laughter she could read and shaking shoulders without hearing a single sound. She had turned around. She had walked 3 blocks home. She had swallowed it whole and called it fine and carried it the way she carried everything. Silently, completely, alone. She was 30 years old now, 7 months pregnant, and she was done turning around. Nadine's office at Lux Staffing was still on the 14th floor, still glass-walled, still smelled like competing perfumes and quiet ambition. Ivory had called ahead, not to announce herself, just to confirm Nadine was in. The receptionist said yes. Ivory said thank you. She took the elevator up. She didn't bring anyone with her. Hyun-jae had offered. Jin-ho had appeared at her office door at 7 that morning with the expression of a man prepared to be a quiet and extremely capable presence in whatever was about to happen. Marcus had called from home and said, in the voice of a 17-year-old who had decided he was grown, "I'll come." She had told them all the same thing. No, this one is mine. Because it was. This one had always been hers. Every room that had measured her and found her wrong, every door she hadn't knocked on, every thing she had swallowed because explaining it out loud felt like more than she could afford. This one was hers to close. The elevator opened on 14. The receptionist, a different one from before, young, with the slightly startled look of someone not accustomed to extremely pregnant women arriving with that particular quality of stillness, looked up. "Ivory Wells for Nadine Wells," Ivory said. "She's expecting me." This was not technically true, but the receptionist, reading something in Ivory's face that made the question of whether to push back feel inadvisable, picked up the phone. 30 seconds later, Ivory was walking through the glass door. Nadine was standing when Ivory came in. This told Ivory something. Nadine had heard the name at the reception desk and had gotten to her feet, which meant she had already decided this conversation required a posture. She was in a cream blazer, and her hair was perfect, and her face was arranged into the expression Ivory had known her whole life. Warm, careful, the performance of a woman doing you a favor. She looked at Ivory's stomach. Something moved across her face. It was gone before it finished arriving, but Ivory caught it, the flicker of a calculation recalibrating. "Ivory," Nadine said, "I didn't know you were coming. Look at you. How far along are you?" 7 months, Ivory said. She closed the door behind her. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the glass-walled office with her hands at her sides and looked at her cousin with the full, unmanaged weight of everything she now knew. Nadine read the room. Her smile stayed on, but her eyes changed, the specific change of a person who has just understood that the script they prepared for is not the one being performed. "Is everything all right?" Nadine said. "No, it isn't, but it's going to be." She reached into the folder she was carrying and placed 3 documents on Nadine's desk, clean copies, organized, the way Ivory organized everything. "I know about the loan. I know about the broker. I know about the referral fee. I know about the other 3 families. I know about the communications, the texts, the emails, the call where you laughed before you finished pressing mute." She paused. "I know all of it, Nadine." Nadine looked at the documents. She did not reach for them. The cream blazer did not move. Her face was very still. "I don't know what you think you found," she said. Her voice was measured, the voice of a woman deciding which shape of denial was most useful. "No one told me," Ivory said. "I found it. I read the footnotes. I followed the threads. I built the picture the same way I built everything, by doing the actual work." She held Nadine's gaze. "That's always been the difference between us. I do the actual work." Something broke open on Nadine's face. Not guilt, not yet. Something older and uglier. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying a resentment for so long it has become structural, and who has just been seen carrying it, and who does not know how to be seen. "You have always thought you were better than me," Nadine said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was thin and sharp and real. "Your whole life, the smart one, the capable one, the only one anybody talked about. Oh, Ivory got into the honors program. Oh, Ivory passed the bar exam. Oh, Ivory holds everything together. Meanwhile, I'm standing right next to you and nobody—" She stopped. "Nobody what?" Ivory said quietly. "Nobody ever saw me," Nadine said. "You took up the whole room. You always took up the whole room." Ivory looked at her cousin. She felt things. She would have been lying if she said she felt nothing. The history was long and the wound was real, and some part of her had always known that Nadine's cruelty had a source, that cruelty always has a source, that hurt people do not become better people just because you understand where the hurt came from. But she also felt something clarify. Something that had been clouded for years by proximity and family loyalty and the specific difficulty of fully seeing the people you grew up alongside. "I know you were overlooked. I believe that. I'm not here to argue with your pain." She paused. "But you routed my mother into a predatory loan. You sat on the phone and laughed while she said yes to a debt that nearly destroyed our family. You took money for it, and you did it to 3 other families who didn't have someone to come find the footnotes." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "Your pain does not explain that. Nothing explains that." Nadine looked at her. The expression on her face was complicated in the specific way that the expressions of people who have done wrong things and know it are complicated, layered with justification and guilt and the desperate calculation of someone trying to find solid ground. "You can't—" "I already have," Ivory said. "The documentation is complete. It's been reviewed. It's already in the hands of the right people." She picked up the folder. "I came here because you're my family. Because I needed to look at you and say it directly, the way I say everything, to your face, without managing it, without softening it." She held Nadine's gaze. "You tried to break us. You used our trust and our desperation and our love for each other as the mechanism to do it. And you did it for $12,000 and the satisfaction of watching me fall." She let that sit in the air. "I didn't fall. My mother didn't fall. My brother didn't fall. We held on, and we found the truth, and we built a case that will follow you for the rest of your professional life." She moved to the door. "The arrest warrant was filed this morning. I imagine you'll be hearing from the appropriate people very soon." She had her hand on the door when Nadine called her name. Ivory turned. Nadine was standing behind her desk. The cream blazer, the perfect hair, the face of a woman who had just understood that everything she had built on a foundation of other people's suffering was about to come down. She looked for the first time in Ivory's memory like someone who had run out of performance. "I'm sorry." It came out thin, unpracticed, the word of a woman who had not said it sincerely in a very long time and was finding that it had gotten harder, not easier. "I know you are," Ivory said. "That's not enough. But I know you are." She opened the door and walked out. In the elevator, the mirrored box dropping through the building, showing her herself from every angle, Ivory stood with her hands folded over her stomach and her face completely still and her eyes bright. Iris moved. A slow, deliberate roll, the kind she started doing in the past 3 weeks, as if testing the dimensions of the space she was in, deciding how much room she was allowed to take up. "As much as you want," Ivory said. "You take up as much room as you want." The elevator opened in the lobby. She walked out into the city. The sun was doing something extraordinary over the buildings, that particular late afternoon gold that makes Manhattan look like it was built to be looked at. She stood on the sidewalk and let it hit her face. Her phone buzzed. Hyunjae. Are you all right? She looked at the message for a moment. She thought about the 28th floor and the folder of zero debt and the man who had listened to her tell the most exposed thing about herself and responded with steadiness. She thought about Iris. She thought about her mother's hand gripping her across the kitchen table. She thought about Marcus and the waiting room argument and the almost smile. She typed back, "I'm better than all right. I'll tell you everything when I get there." 3 dots appeared. Then, "I'll be here." She put her phone in her pocket. She stood on the sidewalk in the afternoon gold and she did not turn around. She did not walk 3 blocks home. She did not swallow it whole and call it fine. She held her head up, the way her mother had always told her to, and she walked forward.
Iris Beaumont Park was born on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with her mother's eyes and her grandfather's name as her middle name, and a waiting room full of people who had no business being there, but were. Jin Ho brought rice cakes. Marcus had argued with the nursing staff about the maximum number of visitors allowed and had won on a technicality. Dolores Wells sat in the chair beside her daughter's bed and held her hand and looked at her granddaughter with the expression of a woman who had spent 20 years in a wheelchair watching the world from a certain distance and had decided, definitively, that this moment made the distance worth it. Hyun-jae stood at the window of the delivery room with his daughter in his arms, not his by blood, his by choice, by presence, by the decision he had made on a Tuesday afternoon when he held her for the first time and understood that the things you choose are the things that count, and looked at Ivory with an expression that Jin Ho, standing in the doorway, later described to his wife as a man who finally found the thing he built everything for. He had said it quietly the night before, in the particular honesty of 2 a.m, with Ivory unable to sleep and him unwilling to sleep, and the city dark below. I spent 15 years building something I could protect people with. I kept waiting for that to feel like enough. It never did. And then you walked into my office with $63 and an argument, and I understood that I had been building the right thing in the wrong direction. Protection isn't worth anything if there's nothing at the center of it that's yours. Ivory had looked at him. And now? He had put his hand on her stomach, Iris already restless, already making herself known. Now, he said, there's something at the center. The debt was paid. Not by labor or time or the careful reconciliation of someone else's ledger. It was paid the way all the real debts are paid, in presence, in honesty, in the willingness to stay in a room that is hard to stay in and keep showing up and keep being real. Ivory had walked into that building expecting to pass through it. She had passed through it and come out the other side carrying something she hadn't arrived with. Not the debt, which was gone, not the fear, which had quieted, not the practiced composure that had kept her standing for years. Something better. The specific, earned peace of a woman who had stopped being invisible, not because the world had changed, but because she had stopped allowing rooms to tell her she didn't belong in them. And the man who stood at the window with her daughter in his arms had understood from the moment she sat down in his office and refused to look away, that she never had. If this story moved you, if you found yourself somewhere in Ivory's walk through that building, or in the debt she carried that wasn't hers, or in the moment when something long held finally lets go, leave a comment. Tell me where you felt it. The best thing about this community is you, the people who show up every week and make it worth building. Subscribe to Love in the Underworld. Hit the bell and come back for the next one, because the underworld always has another story, and the love is always worth it.